She stormed off to another room after the argument, but what her husband saw through the window turned everything upside down. The door slammed shut, and the echo reverberated through the entire house. Rachel clutched the doorknob, trying to steady her trembling hands. Her heart pounded faster than usual, and her breathing was labored. The living room was now behind her, along with Matthew, who hadn't uttered another word after her final outburst. "You never listen to me, Matthew. It's like I don't even exist to you," she had shouted before retreating behind the guest room door. Matthew remained where he stood. His jaw tightened, and his eyes reflected anger mixed with frustration. He ran a hand over his face, attempting to calm himself, but the resentment that had been building for months now erupted to the surface. Meanwhile, Rachel stood by the window. The cool night air seeped through the glass, soothing her frayed nerves. She took a deep breath, staring into the darkness that enveloped the garden. But her attention was caught by a slight movement among the trees. Her heart skipped a beat. It was Alex. He stood in the shadows, watching her window. His gaze was focused, almost magnetic. Alex raised a hand, signaling her. Rachel quickly approached the window and opened it. "Are you crazy?" she whispered, her eyes locked on his face. "You weren't answering," he replied calmly, his voice quiet but firm. She glanced back at the door, as if afraid Matthew might appear at any moment. "You can't be here," she said, but her voice was weak, her fingers still gripping the window frame. "Will you let me in?" he asked, leaning closer. She hesitated. Her mind screamed, no, but something in Alex's gaze made her forget everything. Finally, she stepped aside, and Alex effortlessly climbed into the room. Meanwhile, Matthew couldn't shake a nagging feeling. Something about Rachel's behavior seemed off. The house was too quiet. He approached the guest room door and noticed it was slightly ajar. Taking a step forward, he saw Rachel and an unfamiliar man standing too close to her. "Rachel?" His voice was soft, but it carried barely contained anger. Rachel and Alex turned, both frozen in tense silence. "What's going on here?" Matthew asked, stepping into the room. Rachel desperately tried to think of something to say, but Alex took a step forward, his gaze unwavering. "Why don't you figure it out yourself?" he said, his voice calm but defiant. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Matthew stepped closer, his fists clenched. Alex, in contrast, stood relaxed, but his eyes tracked Matthew's every move. "Who the hell are you?" Matthew asked coldly, his voice low and menacing. "Someone who understands Rachel better than you," Alex replied, a faint smile playing on his lips, which only infuriated Matthew further. Rachel stood between them, her face pale. She tried to intervene, but the words caught in her throat. The situation was spiraling too quickly. "Understands her better than me?" Matthew repeated, his voice trembling with rage. "Maybe you should explain what you're doing in my house." Alex glanced at Rachel, as if giving her a chance to explain, but she stayed silent. Her silence was the final straw for Matthew. He lunged forward, grabbing Alex by the collar of his shirt. Both men tumbled to the floor, and a fierce fight broke out in the room. Alex quickly pushed Matthew away, but the latter was stronger, and within seconds had grabbed his opponent again. "Who the hell are you?" Matthew shouted, gripping Alex by the shoulders. "Tell him, Rachel," Alex retorted with a challenge, maintaining an eerie confidence even in the struggle. "Tell him how long we've known each other." Rachel felt the ground slipping from beneath her feet. Her heart raced faster than ever. "Alex, stop!" she screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the sounds of the scuffle. Matthew tried to land another punch, but Alex dodged and suddenly countered. "You know, this is ironic. Don't you recognize me? We've met before, Matthew." "I don't know," she whispered, her words lost in the heavy silence. Matthew stepped closer, leaning toward Rachel. "Now I want the whole truth, Rachel. You'll tell me everything now, or this will be the end of us." Her eyes filled with tears, but she knew. There was no escape anymore. Rachel felt her breathing grow shallow, as if the air had suddenly turned heavy. She raised her eyes to Matthew, who stood before her with the look of someone ready to accept any answer, even one that would break his heart. "Fine," she said finally, her voice hoarse with tension. I'll tell you. But you need to know. It started long before you. Matthew crossed his arms over his chest, his gaze cold and unyielding. I'm listening. Rachel took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. I met Alex when I was 20, she began, her voice trembling. We dated for a few years. I was in love like never before. He was everything I wanted back then. And? Matthew interrupted, his tone sharp. Rachel nodded, as if she expected his reaction. But our relationship wasn't easy. He was always too impulsive, too reckless. We fought a lot, and eventually, it ended. I left him, but, she paused, swallowing back the tears welling in her eyes. But it wasn't the end for us. Matthew took a step back, as if her words had physically struck him. Are you saying that you kept in touch? Rachel nodded. Yes, but not always. We ran into each other a few times. Then I met you. You were different. You gave me something I never had with Alex, stability, peace, and I thought I could leave it all behind. But you couldn't, Matthew said, his voice barely audible but filled with betrayal. Rachel lowered her head. I tried, Matthew. I tried. But he came back a few months ago. He said he wanted to talk, to close the unresolved chapters of our past. And I let it happen. You let it happen? Matthew repeated, his voice growing louder. You let him into our lives, knowing it could destroy everything? Rachel nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. I was weak. I'm not excusing myself, but I felt so alone these past few months, Matthew. You were distant, you didn't notice me. And Alex, he did. And that justifies betrayal? Matthew raised his voice. That's your explanation? No, Rachel shouted, lifting her head. Nothing justifies it. I know I made a mistake, but it's not just my fault. We both lost what held us together. Matthew was silent. He stood there, trying to gather his thoughts, but only one thing was clear in his mind. She chose someone else, even for a moment, even for a second. Rachel slowly stood up, looking at him. Matthew, I want you to know, I choose you. I want to save our marriage. But Matthew only shook his head. You choose me now, after I know the whole truth? Or is it just the convenient option? Rachel didn't know how to respond. A heavy silence filled the room. Matthew turned to the door, but before leaving, he stopped and said over his shoulder, I don't know if I can forgive this, Rachel. I need to be alone. He walked out, leaving her alone in the empty room, where the silence seemed to swallow everything around her. Rachel sat on the edge of the bed, holding her head in her hands. Her thoughts were tangled, and her heart was pounding as if it might burst. Matthew's words echoed in her mind, repeating over and over, I need to be alone. She knew what those words meant. He didn't just need time to think. He was already pulling away from her. She stood up and began pacing the room, trying to make a decision. This had to end. She had to find Alex and tell him that it was over, once and for all. This situation had already destroyed her marriage, but she still had hope to salvage something. Taking her keys, Rachel quickly left the house. The night air was cold, cooling her cheeks, still flushed from the whirlwind of emotions. She knew where to find Alex. He often mentioned staying at a small motel nearby. When she arrived, the motel looked run down. She climbed the stairs and knocked on the door of the room Alex had once casually mentioned. Who is it? Came his voice from inside. It's me, Rachel, she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. The door opened, and Alex stood before her. He looked surprised but quickly recovered, his eyes gleaming. What are you doing here? He asked, stepping back to let her in. We need to talk, she said, walking inside. The room was small, almost sterile. His jacket lay on the table, next to an open bottle of whiskey. What happened? Did you fight with him? Alex asked, a faint smirk on his face. That doesn't matter, Rachel snapped. I'm here to tell you it's over between us. Alex raised an eyebrow, but quickly masked his reaction. Over? Are you serious? He took a swig from the bottle. Why this sudden determination? Rachel crossed the room, clenching her fists. I can't do this anymore. You're the reason my marriage is falling apart. This has to stop. Alex laughed, but it was a bitter sound. Your marriage isn't falling apart because of me, Rachel. It's falling apart because you're unhappy. I just remind you of who you were before you became his wife. That's not true, she shot back, spinning to face him. I love Matthew. Love him? Alex took a step closer. Then why are you here? Why aren't you with him, fixing your mistakes, instead of standing here with me? Rachel opened her mouth but couldn't find the words. His comment stung because she knew there was some truth to it. You're pulling me backward, Alex, she finally said. And I can't let myself live in the past. Alex stared at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. If that's what you think, fine, he said, his voice calm but his eyes dark. But I want you to know this. You'll come back to me. Maybe not now, but you will. A chill ran down Rachel's spine. No, Alex. This really is the end. She turned toward the door, but as she stepped forward, she felt his hand grab her arm. I'm not letting you just walk away, he said quietly but firmly. Not after everything we've been through. Rachel tried to pull her arm free, but Alex didn't let go. His gaze was intense, and she realized the situation was becoming dangerous. Footsteps echoed somewhere in the hallway, and Alex glanced toward the door, loosening his grip for just a moment. Rachel seized the opportunity and slipped out of the room. Before she shut the door, she heard his final words. You'll think of me again, Rachel, and you'll regret leaving. Rachel exited the motel, her heart pounding as though it would burst from her chest. Alex had left a heavy weight behind, his final words embedding themselves in her mind, creating an unsettling feeling that this wasn't truly the end. She tried to steady herself, inhaling the cool night air, but even that brief respite brought no comfort. She got into her car, her fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She needed to go home. She had to be strong. If she wanted to save her marriage, she had to find a way to convince Matthew to give her a chance to make things right. What she didn't know was that Matthew already knew where she had been. Matthew sat on the couch in the living room, staring at his phone. His patience had worn thin after hours of no messages from Rachel. She hadn't returned immediately after their argument, and her silence only fueled his suspicions. Deep down, he already knew where she had gone. When her car pulled up outside, he was already at the window, watching her every move. Rachel entered the house, trying to be as quiet as possible. She thought Matthew might already be asleep, but when she stepped into the living room, she saw him. He stood in the middle of the room, arms crossed. So, you're back? He said, his voice cold and distant. Rachel froze, like a deer caught in headlights. Matthew, I can explain, she began, struggling to find the right words. Oh, I'm sure you can, he interrupted. You were with him, weren't you? Her eyes widened, and Matthew knew he had hit the mark. Don't lie to me, Rachel. I know where you were, and I know you saw him. Rachel tried to hold herself together, but her hands began to tremble. It's not what you think. I went to him to end it, she blurted out. To end it? Matthew stepped closer, his voice growing sharper. Did you decide to end our marriage or your games with him? I wanted to put an end to that relationship, she replied, lifting her eyes. It was my mistake, but I really want to fix things between us. Matthew laughed, but it was a tense, bitter sound. Fix things? How are you going to fix this, Rachel? How are you going to erase the fact that you went to him, even after everything that's happened? I did it for us, Matthew, she cried, so we could start over. Start over? His voice grew quieter, but more dangerous. Do you think it's that simple? Rachel didn't know how to respond. I loved you, Matthew, she said, her voice trembling. And I still do. But you chose him, he cut in. More than once. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. Both of them froze. Who could that be? Rachel whispered. Matthew turned sharply toward the door. We're about to find out. He opened the door and froze, seeing Alex standing there. His gaze was confident, even brazen. What are you doing here? Matthew asked coldly. Alex didn't look away. I came to make sure Rachel explained everything properly. Matthew stepped closer to Alex, his fists clenched, his voice trembling with anger. If you don't leave right now, you'll regret coming here. Alex just smiled, as if he knew something Matthew didn't. I think you haven't heard everything yet, Matthew. And when you do, the question of forgiveness won't even matter. The tension in the room was unbearable. Matthew stepped toward Alex, their eyes locking like two waves, ready to crash into each other. Rachel stood a few steps away, her heart pounding. She could feel that any action she took might ignite an explosive reaction. "Alex, leave," she said, but her voice trembled and was barely audible. Alex didn't even glance in her direction. "You think it's over, Matthew?" His voice was calm, but there was a chilling certainty in it. "You don't even know half the truth." Matthew took another step forward, his hands tightening into fists. "If you don't leave now," he said through clenched teeth, "this will end very badly for you." Alex simply smiled, tilting his head slightly to the side. "Then do it, Matthew. But it won't change anything." Rachel could see that another second, and everything would spiral out of control. Her mind raced. How could she stop this? How could she make them stop? Her heart told her words wouldn't help anymore. She stepped forward, and before either Matthew or Alex could react, she began unbuttoning her blouse. "Enough!" she shouted, breaking the silence. Both men flinched and turned to look at her. "What are you doing?" Matthew asked, his voice a mix of confusion and lingering anger. Rachel dropped her blouse onto the floor, her eyes locking with Matthew's. "I'm trying to make you stop. Both of you are acting like wild animals." Alex smiled, but now there was a hint of confusion in his expression. "Rachel, this isn't," he began, but she raised her hand, cutting him off. "No, you're both going to listen to me now," she said, her voice firm but tinged with desperation. Matthew stepped back, his gaze darting between Rachel and Alex. "This is your way of solving the problem?" he asked. "My way is to make you think," she said. "What are you doing? What will this change?" "He came to our home," Matthew shouted, pointing at Alex. "And you're defending him?" "I'm not defending him," Rachel replied, her voice rising. "I'm trying to save what's left to save." "Maybe there's nothing left to save," Alex said, his voice quiet but firm. Rachel turned to him, her eyes blazing with anger. "Shut up, Alex. This is between me and Matthew." Matthew looked at them both, his face stone-like. "So, this is all you've got? Distracting us?" he said, his tone mocking but full of pain. Rachel stepped closer to him, her voice softening. "I don't know what else to do. But if we keep going like this, we'll lose everything." Matthew stared at her, his fists unclenching. He felt his anger subside slightly, but the pain and betrayal lingered. Alex watched silently, his expression serious. "Fine," Matthew finally said, "but that doesn't mean I can trust you." Rachel nodded. "I understand." Alex moved toward the door but paused before leaving, casting one last look at Matthew. "We'll see each other again," he said, his words sounding like a challenge. Matthew clenched his fists again but said nothing. He looked at Rachel, his eyes filled with pain and disappointment. After the door closed behind Alex, a heavy silence filled the house. Matthew stood in the middle of the room, staring into nothingness. Rachel stood nearby, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to shield herself from a cold that wasn't there. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't dare wipe them away or say anything. Matthew finally took a deep breath, walked to the window, and peered into the night. Alex was gone, but his words left a heavy imprint on his mind. "We'll see each other again," Matthew repeated to himself. His voice carried distrust and anger. He turned to Rachel, his gaze cold and piercing. "I don't believe that's all," he said, breaking the silence. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to sound calm, but her voice trembled. "Alex," his words. "I'm sure he left more than just a threat. I can feel it." Rachel took a step back, lowering her gaze. "Matthew, please. We can't let him." "Shut up," he interrupted sharply, raising his hand. "I don't believe you anymore, Rachel. How can I after everything you've done?" Rachel sank onto the couch, covering her face with her hands. Her tears now flowed openly, but Matthew paid no attention. He began scanning the room, his eyes searching every corner. He was looking for something, any evidence that Alex had left a mark of his interference. "What are you doing?" Rachel finally asked, watching his actions. "Checking," he replied curtly. "If he said I haven't heard everything, it might mean there's something here I need to find." His search proved fruitless, but Matthew didn't give up. He moved to their bedroom, inspecting every drawer, every shelf. Rachel followed him silently, trying not to interfere. "What's this?" he suddenly asked, pulling a small box from his drawer. Rachel turned pale. It's just old stuff," she replied, but her voice betrayed her. Matthew opened the box and found several letters, photographs, and trinkets he had never seen before. "What are these photos?" he asked, holding up a picture of Rachel and Alex smiling on a beach. "That was a long time ago," she began. "Before us. Then why is it still here?" Matthew interrupted again, his voice trembling with anger. He threw the photo to the floor, his gaze growing even harsher. "Why are you keeping this? Is this your way of remembering him?" Rachel didn't know how to respond. I didn't want you to find out," she admitted, swallowing her tears. "You didn't want me to find out?" Matthew laughed, but it was a laugh filled with pain and betrayal. "What else don't I know, Rachel? Were your relationships with him longer than you told me?" Rachel stayed silent, which only fueled Matthew's anger. "Did you sleep with him?" he suddenly asked, his voice threatening. Rachel looked at him in panic, then turned her gaze away. "Answer me," he shouted, grabbing her arm. "Yes," she exclaimed, "but it was before you." Matthew let go of her arm and took a step back. "Before me? And what about now?" Rachel fell silent. Her silence was the worst answer for Matthew. Matthew threw the box to the floor and walked toward the door. "I'll find out the truth, Rachel. If you won't tell me, I'll find it myself." He left the house, leaving her alone with the shattered photos and the unbearable feeling that their life was falling apart forever. Rachel sat on the floor next to the scattered photographs. Her hands trembled, and her thoughts were a chaotic mess. Her marriage, her life, everything was crumbling before her eyes. But now she knew what she had to do. Alex wouldn't stop until she ended this herself. She stood up, grabbed her keys, and left the house, leaving everything as it was. Her decision was reckless, but she had no choice. She had to meet Alex one more time and convince him to leave them alone for good. The hotel where Alex was staying was as quiet as before. Rachel approached the door to his room, her heart pounding wildly. She knocked, and after a few seconds, the door opened. Alex stood before her, dressed in a light shirt. A faint smile appeared on his face. "Rachel, you again," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "What brings you here this time?" "We need to talk," she said, walking inside. Alex closed the door and turned to her, his gaze sharp. "All right, I'm listening." Rachel stopped in the middle of the room, gathering her thoughts. "You have to leave us alone, Alex," she said bluntly. "This has gone too far." Alex laughed, but there was no joy in his laughter. "Too far?" he repeated, stepping closer. "Rachel, it went too far the moment you decided to leave me. That was a long time ago," she argued. "And we both knew it was the right thing to do." "The right thing?" Alex tilted his head, his smile widening. "Was it the right thing when you came back to me again?" "That was a mistake," she shouted. "I made a mistake, Alex, but it has to end now." Alex stepped even closer, his gaze growing serious. "Do you really think it's that simple? That I'll just disappear from your life?" "You have to," Rachel said, her voice trembling. Alex reached out and gently touched her shoulder. "And what if I say you don't want me to disappear?" Rachel stepped back, her heart racing even faster. "Alex, this isn't a game. I love Matthew." "Then why are you here?" he asked, his voice quieter but more insistent. Rachel didn't know how to answer. Her hands trembled, and one question echoed in her mind. Why was she really here? "I'm not leaving, Rachel," Alex said. "And you know it." She looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. "Then you leave me no choice," she whispered. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the door. Both froze, turning their heads toward it. "Open up. It's Matthew," a voice called from the hallway. Rachel froze, her heart skipping a beat. Alex smiled, his eyes gleaming. "Looks like the show is starting," he said quietly. Matthew banged on the door harder, his voice growing louder. "I know you're in there, Rachel. Open the door, or I'll come in myself." Rachel turned back to Alex, but he just stood there smiling, as if he already knew how it would all end. Rachel stood in the middle of the room, clutching her hands to her chest, trying to gather her thoughts. Matthew outside the door was furious, and she knew his anger would explode if she didn't find the right words. But her efforts to contain the situation were futile because Alex stood nearby, radiating absolute confidence and even satisfaction with what was happening. "Alex, don't make this worse," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. "Worse?" Alex took a step closer, leaning toward her. "You decided to come here, Rachel. Now you have to face the consequences." Matthew banged on the door loudly again, this time harder. "Rachel, open up." She rushed to the door and opened it just enough to see Matthew, but not let him in immediately. His face was tense, his eyes glinting with anger. "What are you doing here?" he burst out, shoving the door wider, forcing her to step back. Matthew entered the room and saw Alex standing nearby, arms calmly crossed. "Of course," he said, the irony in his voice cutting like a knife. "I didn't even need to ask." "Matthew, it's not what you think," Rachel quickly said, stepping in front of him. "Not what I think?" He looked at her, his voice sharp. "You're standing in his hotel room. How could this possibly be not what I think?" Alex chuckled softly, stepping forward. "Relax, Matthew. She just came to talk." "Talk?" Matthew turned to Alex, his fists clenched. "And you expect me to believe that?" Rachel placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to calm him. "Matthew, I came here to end this," she said. "I don't want Alex to be part of our lives anymore." "Is that true?" Alex turned to her, his voice sounding hurt, but his eyes held something else, something manipulative. "Rachel, you forget so quickly how we spent this time together." Rachel froze, her heart sinking. "What are you talking about?" she exclaimed. "We didn't." Alex stepped closer to her, his voice turning soft, almost seductive. "Rachel, are you saying nothing happened? That you want him to believe you came here with pure intentions?" Matthew looked at them, his face stony, but anger burned in his eyes. "What does he mean, Rachel?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Nothing," she exclaimed, avoiding Alex's gaze. "He's manipulating you, Matthew. It's not true." "Not true?" Alex smiled again, stepping closer to her. "Then tell him, Rachel, about that evening when you stayed here. Tell him why you really came then." "Shut up," she yelled, her voice breaking. Matthew slowly turned his head to her. "You stayed here?" "No," she quickly replied, but her voice lacked confidence. "It's a lie." "A lie." Alex spread his arms. "Then tell him why you're so nervous." Matthew stepped back, his face still unreadable, but his voice was cold. "Rachel, if you don't tell me the truth now, I'll find it out myself." Rachel felt her heart stop. Alex stood nearby, smiling as if he knew she couldn't escape the truth now. Matthew looked at Rachel as if seeing her for the first time. His eyes were cold, and his voice, though not loud, carried a threat. "This is your last chance, Rachel," he said, staring straight into her eyes. "Tell the truth, or I'll find it myself." Rachel took half a step back, her hands trembling. She knew Alex's presence only made things worse. His presence was a constant reminder that she couldn't control the situation. "Matthew, it's not what you think," she began, but he raised his hand, stopping her. "I don't want to hear excuses," he said. "I want the truth." Alex, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke, his voice laced with faint mockery. "Why don't you help her, Matthew?" It seems she's struggling to find the right words. "Shut up, Alex," Rachel snapped sharply, but her voice was too weak to affect him. Matthew turned his gaze to Alex. "If you know something, say it." Alex just smiled and pulled out his smartphone. Unlocking the screen and tapping a few buttons, he showed Matthew a photo. "Is this enough for the truth?" Matthew looked at the screen and saw a picture of Rachel and Alex standing close to each other. They were in his hotel room, her hand resting on his shoulder. "That's a lie," Rachel exclaimed upon seeing what Alex was showing. "It's not what it looks like." Matthew lowered the phone and stepped back, his face becoming even more unreadable. "And how should it look, Rachel?" "He's manipulating you," she said, glancing between Matthew and Alex. "This photo means nothing." Alex smiled again, his confidence unshaken. Rachel, if this means nothing, then what will you say about this? He scrolled to another photo, this one showing them even closer, her face almost touching his. Alex, stop it, she shouted, tears streaming down her face. That's all I need to know, Matthew said, nodding. You were together, and you lied to me. Rachel tried to approach him, but he stepped back. I'll draw my own conclusions, Matthew said, and if I find out anything else, you'll regret not telling the truth earlier. He turned sharply and walked out, leaving Rachel and Alex alone. Alex turned to Rachel, his smile widening. Now it's all up to you, Rachel, he said, taking a step closer. Do you really think he'll believe your excuses? Rachel felt her world crumbling even faster. She knew that what happened next would be decisive. Alex approached Rachel, his movements confident yet unhurried. He tilted his head, looking straight into her eyes. Now that Matthew's gone, we can talk without any unwanted witnesses, he said, satisfaction in his voice. Rachel took a step back, trying to maintain distance. Her heart was pounding faster than ever. There's nothing to discuss, Alex, she said. This is the end. I won't let you destroy what's left. Alex smiled even wider, as if her words were nothing but amusement to him. You think you still have a choice? Rachel, I'm not the one destroying things. I'm the one revealing the truth. Rachel clenched her fists, trying not to lose control. You never change, she whispered. And neither do you, apparently, Alex replied, turning to the table where his phone lay. Meanwhile, Matthew was at home, sitting on the edge of his bed. His head was lowered, and his fists were clenched tightly. Everything that had happened spun in his mind like an endless cycle. His trust in Rachel was shattered, but something about Alex's actions seemed too suspicious. He remembered a moment when Alex had mentioned his hotel. Matthew quickly grabbed his phone and began searching for information about Alex. Something made him suspect that this man had more secrets than he let on. After a few minutes of searching, he came across an article that caught his attention. The headline was simple yet alarming. Man accused of fraud in finances and personal relationships. Matthew opened the article and began reading. It described cases where Alex had used his charm and manipulative tactics to gain access to people's personal information. It turned out he had repeatedly blackmailed his victims, exploiting their vulnerabilities. So this is who you really are, Matthew whispered, his fists clenching tighter. He came across a few names in the article. One of them was familiar, a woman who was also his client. Could this go even deeper than I thought? He said to himself, standing up. Rachel and Alex stood facing each other, the tension between them reaching its peak as Alex pulled a folder from his pocket and tossed it onto the table. Does this look familiar to you? He asked, smiling at Rachel. Rachel hesitated before opening the folder. Inside were documents, photographs, and notes she had never seen before. What is this? She whispered, her voice trembling. Just a fraction of what I've gathered over time, Alex said. You think your truth is the only truth, but you don't even know what truth really is. Rachel felt her legs weaken. What are you planning to do with this? She asked. That depends on you, Alex replied. Matthew decided he couldn't wait. He picked up his phone, called the woman mentioned in the article, and arranged a meeting. She confirmed that she, too, had been a victim of Alex and had evidence of his fraud. This changes everything, Matthew said, setting his phone down. Grabbing his keys, he drove to the hotel, determined to confront Alex and Rachel. He was no longer just a man seeking the truth about his wife. He wanted to expose Alex and end this game once and for all. Meanwhile, Alex, unaware of Matthew's return, leaned closer to Rachel and whispered, If you don't side with me, you'll lose everything. Matthew stood before Rachel and Alex, his heart racing as his emotions collided. Anger, pain, and an unexpected flicker of hope. This moment could change everything. Months of doubt, betrayal, and heartache had led to this confrontation. Yet, despite everything, his heart wasn't ready to fully forgive. Rachel's eyes held a mix of sincerity and despair. Alex stood beside her, his cold, confident smile unwavering, as though he had a backup plan if Rachel decided to change her stance. He seemed to know how to twist any situation to his advantage. But Matthew was no longer the man who would allow himself to be manipulated. Rachel took a deep breath, lifted her head, and spoke to Matthew. Matthew, I made a mistake. I lost myself on the way to you, and I let him into my life. But now I realize the only thing I want is to be with you. I want to try again. I'm willing to do whatever it takes for you to forgive me. Matthew looked at her, his face remaining stony. He swallowed hard, struggling to find words. The whirlwind of emotions, painful memories and hopes for the future, clouded his mind. He wasn't sure if he could ever trust her again. Alex, standing aside, watched them. His confidence faltered slightly, though his gaze remained sharp. He stepped closer to Rachel and calmly said, "You know this won't just end the way you want it to. I'll always be part of your life, even if you choose him." Matthew turned to Alex, their eyes locking. Gone was the fear and hesitation Matthew had felt before. His voice carried newfound resolve. "You have no power over us anymore," Matthew said, "and I'll do whatever it takes to make sure of that." Alex shrugged, stepping closer, though his voice carried an unspoken threat. "You may have your resolution, Matthew, but don't forget, truth always finds its way to the surface." Rachel felt Alex's words seep into her consciousness, but she was ready to fight for change. She stepped toward Matthew, taking his hand. "We'll start over, Matthew. I'm leaving this behind. I want to save us. You and me." Matthew looked down at her hand in his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. For the first time in a long while, he saw a flicker of the woman he had fallen in love with. But could they rebuild what had been broken? Alex smirked faintly, watching them with a knowing look. "Good luck," he said, turning to leave. "You'll need it." As Alex walked away, Rachel tightened her grip on Matthew's hand. "I'll prove it to you," she whispered. "I'll prove that I'm worth another chance." Matthew remained silent, his gaze fixed on the door Alex had just exited. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. This was far from over. Matthew looked at her, his heart still trembling with emotion, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes that hadn't been there a few minutes ago. He didn't know what lay ahead for them, but he knew one thing. Life without Rachel didn't feel worth living. Alex, sensing that his game was already lost, stepped back. "This won't be the last time you see me," he said, disappearing through the door, leaving them alone in silence. "What do you think? Can Matthew forgive Rachel and start over, or will their past forever break their relationship?"